It has the last interview we did about a year ago. It worked pretty well.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I believe we are recording now. Okay.
All right.
All right, everybody. Today I am once again have the privilege to speak with Jared Taylor. We had him on about a year ago. We discussed, I believe, kind of the ethics regarding ethnocentrism, kind of going over, um, you know, or I guess you could say, yeah, kind of laying the groundwork for the ethics of what we believe in. But today I kind of wanted to talk about something else. A lot of people weren't happy because they thought that I was going over old stuff that people already know, and I guess that is kind of true. So um, I wanted to ask some questions about strategy and activism for pro-white politics today. So thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Um, I guess
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I guess the first I'll just hop right into. So the first question I have is in America. Do you think that our strategy should differ for pro-white politics than it would in Europe? And the reason I'm asking is because of kind of the electoral system we have here. It doesn't seem like we could realistically make another party. And on top of that, uh, quote unquote, infiltrating like the Republican Party or something like this seems very difficult because it seems like people will easily get acclimated to the party and not actually or not, they'll have a lot of pressure on them to not advocate for our ideas and they'll kind of capitulate over time. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, certainly when there is proportional representation, as there is in Europe, there is a much better opportunity for a small party or for a new party to establish and make itself felt. Um, Now, I think that if there were proportional representation in the United States, and we had a party that represented, in an explicit way, the interests of whites, I think it could easily get 15%, 20%, 25%, a significant chunk of the vote. Now, we don't have that. And if we had, say, 20% of the vote, 20% of the seats in Congress, that would be a huge, really transformative thing. We don't have that opportunity. Now, when you said that the idea of moving into the Republican Party doesn't work because people then become absorbed by the Republicans and simply be Republicans, that's their fault. It's not the fault of the Republican Party. There's no reason why someone cannot run as a Republican and still stick to his principles. My, I have some contacts in the Republican Party, the Virginia Party, and the party in my area of part of Virginia. And it's surprising to me the number of people who are quite sympathetic to our views. And the issue would be to have someone that doesn't have an obvious past. I've got lots and lots of baggage, so to speak, years and years of saying explicit things. Someone who doesn't have that, someone who nevertheless shares our views and is smart, articulate, and wants to run as a Republican. Such a person, I think, can certainly win office at the local level and perhaps even at the national level. As you know, we've had some rather surprising people end up in Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert, people that the established Republicans thought were absolutely unelectable. So I think now more than ever, there is a very clear appetite for an attractively packaged white candidate who will speak for white people and who will do so in an extremely reasonable way. So if people are absorbed into the Republican Party in a way that makes them betray their principles, that's their fault. That's not the fault of the Republican Party.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And I guess I guess you could say, yeah, the concern of them being absorbed into it and not actually advocating. I mean, ultimately, it comes back down to them. But I guess another way to circumvent that, I guess you could call it capitulation, would be maybe creating like lobby organizations that would be outside parties that could also put pressure on the politicians that would advocate for us. Do you think that's a viable solution?
Everything is possible. It's just a matter of getting enough people who are sufficiently motivated to do what needs to be done. I know that at the local level in the Republican Party, the party is dying for volunteers, volunteers who will become precinct captains or district chiefs. These are unpaid jobs, but they end up having very considerable amount of influence. And if you are willing to do the work, then the party is likely to be very happy to have you. And so far as I can tell, the Republican Party, it depends on the location, but it is very unlikely to just run from the room screaming if you have something that might, say, 5 or 10 years ago, have seemed an unpleasant thing in your background. If you have done some tweets about black crime, or if you've been talking about whites becoming a minority and you're opposed to that. So long as you don't say really outrageous things, it's my impression that local Republicans, who, as I say, are desperate for people to fill these party posts, these unpaid party posts, they will be happy to have you so long as you're willing to do the work. Now, sometimes it takes a lot of time. Being a functional, appropriate precinct captain, that takes time and dedication, motivating volunteers, going out and volunteering yourself, or to move into the next level. It can be a district chief job or whatever it is, however it is the Republican Party is structured in your area. As I say, these jobs take a lot of work, certainly to do them properly. They're not paid, and so the party is delighted and grateful to have people who will step forward, so long as you're not an obvious kook, so long as you don't wear a pointy hat or an armband or say crazy things. They really need the work done. And so I believe that there is a deep appetite for people who will speak up for us in a reasonable way.
Right. And I guess it sort of ties into what I was talking about before with groups outside of uh, the political body.
Right, right.
Uh, do you also think so? There's this idea that a lot of people in the right wing talk about instead of organizing underneath like one united kind of organization and advocating through that, that maybe it's a good idea to act in a more decentralized manner as
By
well.
all means, by all means. And you had mentioned operating outside the party. There is no reason, if we were able to raise money, that we couldn't have super PACs, just the way everybody else does. You could start a super PAC to support a candidate with whom you have some sort of informal contact. You can't be officially a function of a candidate organization in order to operate a super PAC and be outside the regulations that would control the campaign spending of a particular candidate. But so long as someone is running whom you think you can trust, then there's no reason why, if you're able to raise the money, you could not pay for advertising for that person, help that person in any way. Anything that's possible in the political system is possible for us, so long as we have the money and the people and the talent and the determination to do it. At the same time, yes, I believe 100% in decentralization. It's not as though we can take over the Republican Party. There's no central organization that is within our grasp. But one of the things that people have been talking about is moving into some of the old clubs, the fraternal groupings, Elks Club, Lions Club, Moose, all of these clubs that used to be extremely active in the United States. Many of them have endowments. Many of them actually have buildings, and they are desperate for new people to come in and help run them. They're like local Republican parties. They have a certain amount of they have tradition, they have activities, but they are in many cases dwindling in numbers quite rapidly. That kind of organization, these fraternal organizations, used to be much more popular in the United States, but people have dropped out of them. And so if they can get, especially young people who are energetic and who are presentable, smart, they are going to just fall upon volunteers like that with shouts of joy to keep the thing going. And then if you're smart, and if you've got the time and the determination, you can move an organization like that into a political direction that is suitable for us. I don't want to name names, but I know of groups that are actually doing this. And they have found, especially organizations that have assets of some kind, that have buildings perhaps, And without that much work and without that many people, so long as you've got guys on the ground who are willing to join and spend the time keeping things going, they're grateful to have you. And if you're lucky, you'll find a group that is overwhelmingly white to begin with, politically conservative. Most of the members will be older, so it won't be too surprising to find people like that. And they, with a little bit of encouragement, are willing or likely to go along with you politically. That's another option that I think is very important. Back to the whole question of running for office. I can't remember now how long ago it was, but none other than David Duke, for heaven's sake, got himself elected to the state house in Louisiana. And this was despite photographs of him in a Nazi uniform, all of these various things, despite the fact that the Republican Party disavowed him. Every single newspaper, I believe, in the state of Louisiana fulminated against him. But he presented himself in an attractive way, said nothing but reasonable things, and he was elected to the state house. That was a remarkable achievement. The point is, this can be done with the right approach. And that was, I think that was, in the 90s. It was quite some time ago. And that was at a time when I think the country was less receptive to a nicely packaged pro-white nationalist message than it is today. It's just a matter of effort. There is another fellow that is less well known by the name of Frank Borzilleri. He ran for school board in Queens, New York. And he was explicitly pro-white. He would go through libraries in schools and insist on removing books from the shelves that denigrated whites, glorified immigration, all of that kind of thing. And he was returned by his constituents year after year with ever larger majorities. The only way New York City got rid of Frank Borzilleri was to unify every single school district in all of New York City so that there was just one. He didn't have the resources to run citywide, but where he was in the Bronx, he had enough support. As I said, he was reelected every time he ran with ever larger majorities. He was probably the most famous and influential school board member in the entire United States. But he was a guy with lots of energy. He would go door to door and motivate people. This kind of job can be taken by people who are on our side. I'm disappointed that this doesn't happen more often. The other side, of course, will screech. The other side will howl and wail. But ultimately, what happens in the ballot box, in the voting booth, is private. And I think so many people are so frustrated that now more than ever, they would be willing to support someone who stands up for us.
Yeah, so that is interesting. I guess what it really comes down to is the reason we don't see more pro-white people in mainstream politics in an electoral sense is just a lack of energy.
I think so. I think so. I'm convinced the opportunities are there. Many people have a rather discouraged view. They read the media. Well, the media is obviously completely against anything that we're up to, anything in the mainstream. But the media do not reflect the people. I take great comfort for the fact that, for example, ex-President Donald Trump, he is facing 91 felony counts in all of these different trials, all of these different court cases in various parts of the country. Ordinarily, a politician in the United States that the media constantly was blasting as a threat to democracy, who was involved in court cases of that magnitude and that number, would have no chance with the American people. Voters would say, even Republican voters who are conservative would say, my gosh, this guy must simply be no good. Well, look at the millions of people who, every time a pollster comes by and asks, say, yes, he's my favorite candidate. He's the guy I'm going to vote for. This shows an extraordinary level of disaffection among Americans, American voters. This shows the degree to which people are prepared to look at practically every ruling and governing institution of this country, not only universities, churches, government, the media, and say, you guys are all wrong. Every last one of you. You may hate this guy. You may be trying to get this guy in jail for the rest of his life. To heck with you. He's my man. And this takes at least in this day and age of massive media concentration, which for the most part is all skewed in a leftist direction, to stand up and say, you guys are all wrong, that is extraordinary. That reflects, to me, a moment in American history that is exceedingly promising, in which people who take the initiative will be able to take some of that disaffected energy and make really significant changes in what's happening in our country.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to another thing I was thinking about in regarding the media. There's someone that I know. He used to be on YouTube. He unfortunately his channel got taken down. He's on Twitter. His name is Joel Davis, and he talked about this idea of before. And I'm not. Maybe it wasn't necessarily before, but you should also make an effort to use social media and all forms of media, which I guess that's exactly what American Renaissance does, to actually change the culture
Yes,
and the way people think outside of politics. So that way it could indirectly influence it later, or actually directly influence it, quite literally.
yes. Well, no, you're absolutely right. That's something I should have mentioned. I suppose I almost take it for granted and therefore did not mention it. But the more people that agree with us, then the more likely things that we haven't even imagined will happen. If we start with 1 million people, there are 325 million people in the United States. 1 million people, that's a small percentage. But 1 million active, committed people can accomplish a lot. 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, they can accomplish even more. And that has been the purpose of American Renaissance ever since I founded it in 1990. That's getting on to 34 years ago. And in my view, you can make a distinction between education and politics. And at the time I founded American Renaissance, there was very little, even in the way of education, much less in terms of politics. Now, my personality, for good or for bad, is more towards education. I like ideas. I like debate. I like discussion. I have never run for public office, and people have urged me to many times. And I suppose it would be good discipline to do something that's not necessarily in my own nature. But I've never done so. But I have been as supportive as possible for those who did do so. So, yes, you're absolutely right. We need to make use of every form of communication that is available to us. And it's remarkable when you think about it. In the first part of the current 21st century, I'd say up until about 2015, the internet was remarkably free. Remember, there was a time when Twitter described itself as the free speech wing or the free speech party of the free speech movement. And they actually thought that. I think when Dalton, what is the guy's name? Dorsey, Jack Dorsey, who was running the company at the time. I think his heart was really in the idea of libertarianism, that let every idea be expressed. Well, as it turned out, the other side discovered that when every idea can be expressed, their ideas didn't hold up very well. They had the power, but we were right and they were wrong. So they started clamping down on us. And that's why, about 2015 and onward, then Twitter, which had these very clear rules that discussed the only reasons that they could justify closing down your account. And they were really very clear. There were such things as promoting illegal activity, making credible threats of immediate violence, impersonating someone, copyright violation, putting up somebody's confidential information, publicizing stuff that was private, somebody's social security number, threatening to hire a hitman to get rid of your mother-in-law. I mean, obviously bad stuff. Those are the only reasons that would justify closing down your account. That's the way it should be. That was real free speech. But I believe it was in 2017, they changed their terms of service. And they said, we're going to take down anybody we like for whatever reason we like. But up until that point, the internet was remarkably free. Now, of course, that means if we get kicked off of one platform, we have to do our best to establish other platforms, go to other platforms. But you are absolutely right. We seize every opportunity to get our message out. And as more and more people come to agree with us, again, I'm repeating myself, but things will develop in ways that we can't even necessarily predict right now.
Right, and that's kind of the benefit of decentralization as well.
Exactly.
Because
Exactly.
if we do get stamped out on, like, let's say Twitter, right? You could always make a new account. If it sounds, there's limits to that, you could eventually get your
Yes.
phone number banned. But
Right.
um, you could always, there's a lot of, it's more fluid and you can move a lot. I'm
Yes.
actually very optimistic personally about Twitter. I know you still haven't gotten your account back.
That's
Everyone
correct.
is trying their best to get that happening for you. Um,
I'm very grateful for all the people on X, as I suppose we have to call it now, who are expressing themselves, trying to get me reinstated. It may be that I'm difficult to reinstate because after I and American Renaissance were kicked off, we sued Twitter. Of course, that was under the old regime, and you would think that Elon Musk, with his position of defending freedom of speech, wouldn't care that we sued people back when he was not running the show. But that may be one of the reasons why I'm kept off. I don't know. I've tried many times to go through the appeals procedure. I even went to the trouble of writing a U.S. mail letter addressed to Elon Musk at their office in San Francisco, asking him, would he please consider putting me back on? I got no answer. I figured there was maybe a 50-50 chance I would get an answer saying, sorry, go away. But no answer at all. I've done what I can to get back on, and I haven't completely lost hope that it will be possible to restore my account and that of American Renaissance, which is my organization. But yes, I am deeply grateful for the large number of people who have many times addressed themselves to Elon Musk and said, look, Taylor is not a threat or a menace, doesn't violate anybody's rules. Please put him back on. Thank you very much for that.
yes, and the good news is because I'm on Twitter a lot now, and I notice because there's more of us, it's more free. There's a lot more people from our side of the um,
Yes,
view on there.
yes.
And you made
Mhm.
a good point that when we have the ability to speak, we do kind of wipe the floor.
That's right.
Like I haven't seen because I started getting into this in late 2019, early 2020. So to many people, I feels like a long time to me, but it's still very new. It's only 4 years, and
Mhm.
I remember kind of feeling alone in many ways because we were very censored back then. I didn't really even see any of our stuff, and then all of a sudden, just like this boom out of nowhere. I guess like 2020, 2020, 2021 were kind of like a dark year for the dissident right. But then all of a sudden, like this boom just happened, and then I see so many our ideas are kind of like discussed amongst normal people now, which is what you want.
Yes. Yes,
Uh,
exactly. Exactly. Well, imagine what it was like in 1990. Perhaps that's even before you were born.
yeah,
When I first got into this business, it was a very, very lonely business. And a point I would make. This is sort of a historical thing, but that was even before the internet. American Renaissance, my publication, it was a print publication. It was a monthly magazine. In those days, in order to get any real good sense on all of the questions that matter most to us, you had to poke around in dusty corners of university libraries, or you had to write to obscure P.O. boxes in Olathe, Kansas, or someplace to get any kind of information. And the internet was a huge boon. And there was a time, as I say, up until this period of cancellation and censorship that really went into gear, when with a few mouse clicks, you could discover a whole world of dissident thought. And I am very encouraged, of course, by the fact that Elon Musk took over Twitter. The whole idea of making free speech genuinely free again is back under discussion, and it has to be thanks to him. So I'm extremely optimistic. I agree with you. It seems that our ideas are being discussed in mainstream ways that had never happened before. And you take people like, I don't know, Matt Walsh, or who's the guy at Turning Point USA? Oh, for heaven's sake, why can't I think of his name? Um, well, many people who would have run screaming from the room at the idea of any kind of racially conscious observation that talked about the interests of whites. They are now saying some of the things that we have been saying for the last 10 or 15, even 20 years. So all of this is greatly encouraging.
Yeah. Do you think part of that might also have to do with the fact that the pressure and kind of like the anti-whiteness has increased? Because I feel like the more it's increased on white people, the more racial consciousness will kind of come about. Like when I first started talking to people, like my father, for instance, he kind of didn't like they didn't really, the age old I don't care about race.
Right.
Well, but okay. And then a couple years later, that tone doesn't exist anymore. Now people are starting to kind of be aware of this. And I think it has to do with the fact, and I kind of checked out of mainstream media, but then when I see it once in a while when I'm at someone's house, I do notice it's gotten a lot worse with anti-white rhetoric.
Yes. Well, I am not of the school that worse is better. Sometimes worse is just plain worse. But it is true that the more outrageous the other side gets, the more ordinary white people are shaken out of their complacency. I almost never watch television, but I understand that you almost never see a television ad anymore with a white couple. They're always some sort of mixed race, or they're Asians, or they're blacks, all very stylishly dressed. But the idea of a white couple, usually if there's a white person involved, there's an Asian spouse or a black spouse. And why is this? Why is this? Even ordinary, I believe none other than Joe Biden commented on this at one point. He seemed to be thinking it was a great idea. But this is just rubbed in our face all the time. And it's very encouraging to me that the opposition now to critical race theory, it used to be, oh, this is divisive, this is anti-American. More and more people are coming straight out and saying, this is anti-white. Now, I don't like the fact that all of these signs of incipient white racial consciousness are defensive. That's for the most part what they are. We need to take the offensive. We need not just to stop a creeping expanse of this anti-white foolishness. We need to force it back and be in a position to assert our interests, not simply being defending against encroachments on our interests. But I see the mood of the country more and more going in that direction. And that, of course, is why the other side is so hysterical. You can hardly open the pages of the Washington Post, the New York Times, without reading some hair-raising, hand-wringing article about how democracy is threatened, not just by Donald Trump, but by all of these white people who are survivalists, for example, or white people who are concerned about preserving their Second Amendment rights. They're terrified. They're absolutely terrified. And to me, it's typical. When an orthodoxy crumbles, and this one is crumbling, it's shaky as never before, that is when it tends to lash out more viciously than ever. So, as I say, I'm extremely optimistic, but I guess if I hadn't been an optimist, I wouldn't have started American Renaissance as long ago as I did. And certainly, judging from the kinds of reactions we get to our videos, to our podcasts, to our online articles, discussions, there is just no question. More and more people are waking up. And as I say, ultimately, it's a matter of numbers. What you cannot do with 1 million people, you can do with 10 million people. And even at the local level, what you can't do with 5 people, you can do with 50 people. And as our numbers increase, so will our power and influence. And at the same time, so much more desperate and vicious will our rulers become. So it'll be a battle, but all real changes. And when you think about it, in some respects, we are revolutionaries. We want to turn the orthodoxy, certainly, on race in the United States completely upside down and inside out. All revolutionary change is hard work, but I see more and more people who are willing to do that hard work.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing you brought up, the idea of revolutionary, because the original term of that meaning before it was associated with changing things for the sake of changing things used to mean a return to a point. And in the sense of, well, what we would be wanting to do is returning to a point of what was normal in America, which is a white majority. So
Yes.
that really is true. And um, Yeah, and that is good because I did notice too, like a big part of the early dissident right was pushing back on that critical race theory stuff. Is well, the problem isn't that it's collectivist. No, collectivism is okay. The problem is that it's anti-white. Um,
Yes, exactly.
and I remember, I mean, I'm 21 years old now almost, and I remember being in high school, and uh, my last couple years of high school, I believe it was senior year, we had to read Stamped from the beginning, this book by Ibram X. Kendi.
Oh boy.
It was
Yeah.
just, I was like, I felt like the only person in the class who could see what was going on. I was also pretty much the only white person there. But
Oh,
uh,
wow. That's quite an education, going to school with a whole bunch of non-whites.
yeah, and I was like, yeah, this is horrible, and it was just assigned homework. And but if you read the stuff that was in there, it was crazy. I can't remember exactly, but I think this man wanted to create like an unelected, like sort of black body in the government to like stamp out racism, like in. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. You
Well,
maybe know, I think.
yes, he wanted, as I recall, an amendment to the Constitution that would set up a Department of Anti-Racism, and it would have the power to overturn any kind of local regulation and I believe national law that had the result of increasing racial disparities. A kind of dictatorship, a dictatorship which would clearly be run by people like himself. And its sole purpose was to make equal outcomes for people of all races. And it's a breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking expression of a brute desire for ultimate power, dictatorial power, so that his people would be pushed forward. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that they cleared it. Well, it was veiled in this sort of it's for all races, but as that saying goes, anti-racism is often code for anti-white. Uh,
Yes.
it's very clear in that instance. That's exactly what it is. Um,
Well, I have a question for you, though. What was it about you and your experience that enabled you to see through this? Because a lot of white people your age, I mean, you've been reared probably ever since grade school, being told that white people are a very doubtful and perhaps evil bunch, and we're responsible for everything that's ever gone wrong for anybody anywhere else in the world, anytime in history. How come you could see through it? What was it about you that gave you that ability?
well, the thing is, I grew up in New York, and New York is well, at least the part I grew up in, I guess, was very diverse. The part I grew up in originally was mostly Irish, Italian, and Jewish, but then um, over the years, more blacks from Brooklyn and the Bronx moved in, and I kind of noticed, just I had a dose like race realism was basically my experience growing up.
Well, good for you. Um, there was a guy named Robert Patterson. He was one of the founders of the what was called the White Citizens Council. This is a group that was established in the late 1950s, and it was referred to as the Uptown Klan because these were racially aware white folks, and they were pillars of their community. They'd be ministers, they would be school teachers, they would be businessmen, and one of his phrases was, a sure cure for integration fever is a stiff dose of Negroes. In other words, if you think that it's going to be a great thing, well, just experience it. And it sounds as though it was the experience you had that opened your eyes. Now, what happens so frequently is that people get a dose of diversity, and at some level, that between consciousness and unconsciousness, they don't like it, but instead of changing their minds, instead of learning, they just run away. That is the standard white reaction. Now, it sounds as though, for whatever reason, you were living in a manner that did not involve running away, that you were surrounded by this diversity, which is, we're told over and over again, is America's greatest strength. But simply by keeping your eyes open, you discovered just how awful it ultimately is.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I mean, just growing up, I kind of if you can't deny, in my experience, you can't really deny something that's right in front of you.
Right.
Um, if I see a car accident in front of me and someone says that's not a car accident, I can't I can't
Yes.
deny that. Um,
Well, the strange thing about it is I have spoken with some ardent liberals, and they will concede that, well, yes, when they were in junior high school, there were certain bathrooms, certain parts of the school that blacks just took over. And if a white kid wanted to go to the little boys' room, he couldn't. He'd get beat up if he walked into that place. Or that it was invariably the case that Hispanics would gang up on white kids and take their lunch money or whatever it was. They've had that experience, but it doesn't make them change their minds. What it does is stimulate this extraordinary capacity white people have to make excuses. And they would look back on that now. Now, of course, they have protected themselves. They've run away from that kind of experience. They no longer have that kind of experience. They live in some much better behaved neighborhood, and on the job, they're not surrounded by blacks or Hispanics who are taking their lunch money. So what they do is they make excuses for the behavior of those children. Well, they were victims of racism, they were victims of oppression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So people can have experiences that should have completely changed their way of thinking, but instead it simply made them masters of excuse making.
Right, and that's an interesting thing, because all it really takes to kind of refute that is, well, look at the behavior in America and look at the behavior in places like in Europe, where they brought in blacks recent times, and there's no space for quote unquote oppression like there was in America.
That's right.
And it's
That's
just
right.
behavior. And look at places in Africa where whites don't really exist. It's the
Yes.
same thing. The
Yes.
very unfortunate thing also in my school is, because there was this sort of lack identity, because it's racial consciousness for me but not for thee kind of attitude
Yes.
among everyone else who isn't white. So a lot of white kids that were there, they didn't really know what to do. So instead of forming with their own sort of clique, they kind of just what I would call negrify themselves and start trying to blend in with black kids and all these sorts of things. And it's like, well, no, like you just kind of like that's not really. It's first of all, they're not even going to see you that way. No matter
No.
how hard you try. So there's no point in even going that route. And then later, when I was 16 years old, 17 years old, I was very much a libertarian, and I first found your videos through this guy Stefan Molyneux. You did an interview with
Oh,
him.
yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
I was like, oh, okay, this makes a lot of sense. Actually, I kind of known this my whole life. I just didn't know how to
Yes.
articulate it, and then that's how I kind of got to where I am now.
Well, I think even people who have had experiences that have tended to open their eyes, it's always good to have someone say, yes, what you're feeling is legitimate. Your conclusions are absolutely correct. It doesn't make any difference. All the people telling you that, no, 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 don't believe your own eyes. What you are seeing is the truth, and go ahead, open your eyes, open your mind, and draw the consequences. It's like anything else. I have been in on many occasions over the years, I have been in a group of people, and I have stood up and made some obvious racially oriented point. And I will stick to my guns, but it is so much easier if someone else agrees with you, just one person or two people. When you are completely by yourself, and although what you see is very clear, and in retrospect, after your eyes have been completely opened and you've understood the way America works, it's just blindingly clear. Yet, when you're the only person, it is easy to doubt your own conclusions. Believe it or not, there was a time when the conferences we put on by American Renaissance were broadcast by C-SPAN. And we would always put the phone number of the office on the podium. And so it was part of the image that was broadcast by C-SPAN. And it was such a joy to answer the phone. And people would call up, and very frequently there would be, the statement would be something along the lines of, thank God, now I know I'm not insane. Because if you're the only person, I mean, you see things that are so clear that run completely counter to what everyone is telling us is true and what we're supposed to believe. We are herd animals. We are not very good at being completely isolated and disagreeing with absolutely everyone around us. So the temptation is think, my gosh, am I insane? So the fact that you are around even just a few people, and the more the better, who see things, who see reality, who are able to not only see reality, but to articulate it. That's hugely, hugely important for our psychological well-being.
Yeah, and the other maybe people feel insane because of the fact that at least because I'm a younger person, when I grew up in America, like I never lived in a homogenous area. The only homogenous places I've stayed in have actually only been in Europe.
Mhm.
Um, and I think of unfortunate thing is a lot of, and maybe this can change. I think, but a lot of white people don't feel attached to the concept or the country America because they don't feel racially united.
Yes, yes.
Um,
Well, you know, it's an ironic thing. Somebody like, well, Joe Biden. Joe Biden is talking about he's going to run for president, what he's going to run on. Apparently, this guy, just as he did in his inaugural address in 2021, he's acting as if the only real problem America has is white supremacy. He's going to fight white supremacy, root out white supremacy. As if, and he goes along with all of these ideas about how wicked the founders were, how we've got to extirpate not only every Confederate, but everyone who ever said anything unkind about Black people. And yet, we're supposed to be patriotic Americans. He's going to tell young people, yes, you should join the armed service. You should be prepared to die for this country. What? I mean, after being told over and over that America is one long crime scene and that the history of the United States is one of slavery and genocide and white supremacy and homophobia and male chauvinism, whatever it is, the latest crime du jour of white people, it's an utterly schizophrenic state of affairs. I mean, this guy, when it suits him, he'll put his hand on his heart and look like he admires the American flag, and yet he tells us over and over and over what a rotten, wicked country this is. You simply cannot run a country with that kind of crazed attitude, that kind of contempt for your own ancestors. So, uh, what are whites to think of their country? And I think more and more racially conscious whites have really said psychologically, they've just turned their back on the country. If it's going in this direction, to heck with it. I'm sure not going to join the military. I'm sure not going to get teary-eyed when I hear the Star-Spangled Banner. All this stuff is run by people who are opposed to me and my interests. And so who else is going to carry the country forward? It's always been white people who really volunteered for the combat arms in the military, who were really, truly patriots, who are the ones whose eyes tear up if they hear John Philip Sousa marches. And if those people give up on the country, what's going to hold it together? And I think that's a perfectly legitimate question. And all of these people who are telling us how wicked our ancestors were, they don't seem to realize that they are destroying, they are dissolving whatever glue is left that can hold the country together.
yeah, you can't actually have a country and then um, try and organize it in a way where you're basically beating it to death. It's suicidal,
Yeah,
really.
yes, yes. I mean, and they don't seem to realize this. At the same time, there's something for which I would reproach white people. And I was certainly this way when I was your age. I was very individualistic. I didn't care really very much, only in the most abstract way, about anything beyond my own life, my own circle. Whereas any healthy country is composed of people who don't think only about themselves or their family, but who think in the longer term with a wider circle. If you had asked me when I was in my 20s or early 30s, well, what do you think of the fact that white people are not having enough babies to reproduce themselves, that more white people are dying than babies being born? I said, who cares? Not my problem. That's not the kind of mentality that makes for a healthy country. And it is very easy for whites to feel that way, given that all of the authorities in this country are telling them that they are the cancer of human history, basically. But whites who have some sense of community, who have a sense that they are part of this glorious tradition of Western heritage, those people have to think in terms far beyond their own identity. Ultimately, I like to talk about the world brotherhood of Europeans because we are Europeans. Everything about white culture in the United States, the religion, the language, the music that we listen to, although the texture of life that white Americans, but everything from the tops of our heads, the tips of our toes, we are Europeans. And I find more and more that racially conscious people all around the world, whether they're Frenchmen or Canadians or South Africans or Estonians, all of them see the problem in exactly the same way. We are in precisely the same fix. And that is another reason for my sense of optimism, that it's not just Americans who are waking up, but Europeans, white people everywhere. And they have this sense that we are part of a world brotherhood.
Yeah, that's something I kind of wanted to bring up as well. I am of the opinion that, and this is not to be pessimistic, but just to be realistic, I think that in the case of Europe, I think it's going to be a lot easier to fix the immigration issues in Europe because you're dealing with smaller patches of land. So, for
Yes.
example, if you were a police officer and you were asked, do you want to shut down a party at a mansion or an apartment? You're going to want to pick the apartment. It's much easier to deal with.
Yes,
So,
yes.
uh,
Well, I think, well, it depends on what part of Europe we're talking about. The Eastern Europeans, the countries on the other side of what we used to call the Iron Curtain. And I remember in the Soviet era, we used to feel sorry for those people. And from an economic point of view, they were suffering. From a free speech point of view, they were suffering. On the other hand, they were not constantly being exposed to the horrible poisons that Americans invent and concoct and brew up in industrial quantities and spread all around the world, unlike the Western Europeans who were subject to that kind of treatment. And so in Eastern Europe, there's still an instinctive sense of nationhood. The best example, of course, is Hungary under Viktor Orban. He's been pretty explicit. He says, look, Hungary is a European, it's a Christian nation. We don't want Muslim problems. And look at you, Western Europeans. Why on earth would we want to import this kind of problems that you've got? So there is a sense of that remaining. But Europeans, I think, they have a more rooted sense of being a nation. There are a lot of Frenchmen who realize that they've been French for 15 centuries in a way that Americans have been American citizens only since 1776 or 1783 or whenever it is, whenever you want to call the establishment of the United States as a country with its own constitution. Also, we have been populated by many Europeans from all sorts of different places, some of whom came over here with some of their old grudges, the English and the Irish, for example. So we, I believe, compared to Europeans, do not have the same sense of cultural and historical rootedness that most Europeans do. At the same time, it's been astonishing to me that even, say, a country like Sweden, it never practiced slavery, it never had an overseas empire, and yet there's something about white people that makes it easy to deceive them and trick them and to make them think that somehow they are responsible for all the world's problems. And the only way to solve the world's problems is to let all these problem people come live with you. So even if you don't have the kind of history that the French have, they had an empire, and you can say, well, they mistreated the Senegalese and they mistreated the Algerians, and Napoleon reestablished slavery, and you can make all this jabber about how they were bad. You can't make that argument about the Swiss or certainly the Eastern Europeans, and yet we are still subject to this. So we have to flush out all of these insane views about our history with which you've been inculcated. And then to get back to the other point that I mentioned, white people have to realize that we are in this together, that we are not just individuals. And it is as white people united in our goals that we can salvage this wonderful heritage to which we are heirs.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. I think it's kind of a weird um, thing because you see, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I guess the more that the pro-white message is spread, I'm seeing these very interesting sort of, and their attempts to like actually refute our ideas, but they're very poorly thought out. One of them that I've come across is, well, there's always this one of why people don't exist.
White people don't exist, right? Yes.
And I was arguing with somebody about this, and they go, well, white people don't exist because, well, they came to be along a process. They didn't exist back in history. I'm like, wait a minute. We all, as individuals, we were born as a process. I didn't just pop into existence. Do I not exist now? Like, we could just apply this logic to a bunch of other things. Planets, do they not exist because they formed over time? Um, you see like a lot of these really seemingly intellectual arguments, but they're really nothing underneath. And another one regarding colonialism is like, well, whites had a colonial empire, so therefore you have to let millions of North Africans into your country. Well, how does that follow?
Right, right. Yeah, it doesn't follow at all. In fact, I was just reading the first translated volumes of essays by Renaud Camus. He is the great Frenchman who came up with the phrase "the Great Replacement," which I think is an absolutely brilliant way to describe what's happening to white people essentially all around the world. And he made a point about colonization that I'd never heard before. He says, at the time of the independence being granted to Algeria, which had been part of France ever since I think about the mid 19th century. It was colonized to a much more serious extent than any other part of the French Empire. In fact, it was considered part of France itself. At the time of independence, I believe that was 1963, 64. In any case, the white colonists were about 10% of the population of Algeria. And the Algerians said, look, we're independent now. We will not tolerate the presence of such a large group of people who are not Algerians. And the ultimatum for them to the whites who were living there was either the suitcase or the coffin. Either you pack your bags and clear out, or we will take care of you. And nobody else thought that that was particularly strange. The world more or less accepted this. The colonists had to clear out. Well, what on earth then logically leads to all of these North Africans who presumably were being dreadfully mistreated by the French? All of a sudden, what gives them the right to go to France? And as Camus points out, ordinarily, people who think that they have been oppressed and their culture exterminated and all these bad things the French are supposed to have done while they were running North Africa, ordinarily those people don't want to go and live under the administration of these awful people. And yet, of course, they swarmed across the Mediterranean. And now France has perhaps 15%, maybe even approaching 20% of its population made up of these people, if you're just talking about Algerians, who absolutely refuse the idea that 10% of their population be composed of aliens. What's going on here? How does this possibly make sense? Well, it makes sense only by the perverted moral standards that white people seem to have invented and adopted for themselves.
Yeah.
No, but one other point, you're talking about some of these cuckoo intellectual ideas. The idea is that race is a social construct. I mean, as I often say, this idea is so wrong and so stupid that only very intelligent, clever people could possibly persuade themselves that it's true. I mean, good grief! You look at an Australian Aborigine, and you look at you look at an Eskimo, and the difference between these two groups is supposed to be all in our minds. I mean, and people pretend to take this seriously. I just don't get it. It's an astonishing ability that relatively smart white people have of completely fooling themselves. And you never find black people, or almost never, falling for this nonsense. Race doesn't exist. Come on, they know very well race exists. Race is an important part of their identity. It's central to their identity. They must just shake their heads in bewilderment about that cuckoo things white people say.
Yeah, that's a very crazy thing because another one that's similar to that is I was arguing with somebody, and they identified as some kind of traditionalist right winger. And they said, well, the term white didn't exist until the 1700s. I'm like, well, the term for the sky for the sun probably didn't exist until the formation of the English language. Does that mean the sun didn't exist before?
Right, right.
It's like the things that terms apply to doesn't mean they don't exist before the terms exist. Like there's actually a word for it. I think it's called the word concept fallacy in
Mm,
philosophy.
mm.
When you associate the concept of something with the word and you can't
Yes.
distinguish between the two, like it's
Yeah.
a really, I think it's just dishonest at the end of the day.
It just goes to show you the lengths to which white people will go to come up with these verbal tricks to avoid looking reality in the face. I don't understand it. I don't understand it either. Obviously, if you're living in Europe in, I don't know, the 10th century, and the only people you ever see around you are white people, you're not going to think of yourself as white. You're not going to think in terms of racial differences. It would be crazy if you did. It's only in the theoretical possibility of coming up with space aliens that we think of ourselves as earthlings. But somehow we're supposed to think that race didn't exist because people didn't talk about race or think about race. Of course it existed. All you had to do was be an explorer, a world explorer, and come across people of other races. And in every recorded instance in which, say, the Chinese, for example, at one point, they were ocean-going sailors. This is even before Columbus. They sailed all the way to Africa. They were astonished by Africans. What in the hell are these creatures? And when white people showed up in Japan, 1853, Commodore Perry shows up and opens the country. They couldn't get over how strange and odd these Europeans look. The idea that somehow only white people notice the difference and that we have somehow invented the concept of race in order to exploit non-white people. Again, this is part of this fantastic ability white people seem to have to fool themselves, not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of others. Ordinarily, when people deceive themselves, it's because they can find some sort of advantage. They can take some sort of advantage about justifying something that's otherwise unjustifiable. But now we justify these things that are unjustifiable, that are entirely to our hurt. This is without precedent, I think, in any human group.
Right. And that's an interesting thing because um, if you were going to create something to oppress people, it would actually have to like correspond to reality in some sense for it to actually work. If I'm
True.
going to create a classification, um, it can't just be made up and now you understand like it wouldn't work if it didn't actually correspond to what I'm dealing with.
Exactly. And the other side understands that perfectly when they talk about diversity and inclusion. They know very well who counts as diverse. If you're going to try to diversify an organization or a business, they know very well that too many white people is no good. Well, how do they know that you're white if race is some sort of optical illusion? The whole idea is just so preposterously stupid that it is incredible that we have to sit here and even talk about it.
Yes, and just kind of going back to the topic that we started because we'll be finishing up soon.
Yes.
There is, I think we were talking about how, oh yeah, psychologically, white Americans kind of feel disassociated from the country because, well, they don't really
Yes.
see themselves. I think a big way to kind of get over that hurdle, and it's something that I've done, is create pro-white friend groups, just people you know who share the same opinions. And I'm not
Yes.
necessarily saying do activism all the time. Just be friends with people who are like you, um,
Yes.
and this is a good way to go. And you have all the online stuff, and that's all good, but that also has to translate into real life at some point.
Yes. Yes. It certainly does. That's a very good point. Many people seem to think that what we do online is perhaps even more important than the things we do in real life. It just doesn't work that way. Real life has got to change. And making arguments on Twitter or friending people who say the same thing, that doesn't change real life. But it can lead to changing real life, as I said before, the more people whose eyes are opened and the more people who are determined to make the difference. Now, in a way, it's getting back to the initial purpose of this conversation. What is it white people are supposed to do? In a way, I'm flattered that you would ask me this question because I'm really simply an observer. I have the deepest admiration for people who have run for office, the people who do take ideas into the streets, people who do banner drops or flash mobs, all of those things. I think those things are very important. Sometimes they have gone wrong when people miscalculated as to what the effect was going to be. But all of those things are hugely, hugely important. And as I say, I'm certainly as optimistic even as I was in 2016. 2016 was a big year for what we used to call the alternative right, the alt-right, because Donald Trump seemed to be charging onto the scene in ways that forced people to bring up some of these questions. Well, we needn't talk about Donald Trump and the disappointments that many people felt in the way he handled his presidency. But entirely aside from Donald Trump, this year, and I believe the years to come, are going to give us tremendous, tremendous opportunities. And as I often say, I wish I were 30 years younger so that I could be in the fight for 30 more years, because things are bubbling. Things are percolating. Things are changing. This is going to be an opportunity for men like you, young people who understand what's going on, who are thoughtful, and who are prepared to take fate into their own hands. I think it's going to be a great time to be a young, racially conscious white man or woman, and I envy you that.
Yes, and that, I guess, this kind of brings me to my final point or question here. There's this very popular idea. Um, it's in mainstream conservative circles, but it's also in our circles too, about balkanization within America for white
Yes,
people. And
right.
some people idealize that. I think it's a horrible idea. I kind of view it as a form of retreat. Now I understand why white people would not want to live in the inner cities. I mean, as someone who's been around that, I understand that. But I think as a long-term solution, slowly drifting back is how you become a minority in your own country. And
That's right.
that's why, and this goes back to what you're saying, you need to be on the offensive to actually
Yes.
retake what is yours.
Yes. And you cannot win a game by playing defense. You simply cannot. You don't score points by simply keeping the other guy from kicking the ball through your goal post. You have to go out and score points. And again, as I say, I think people of your age, intelligence, caliber, energy, you are going to be able to create great things.
Yes, well, thank you for joining me today. If there's anything else you wanted to add, feel free.
Nope, nope. It's been a pleasure to be your guest on this occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.